Soviet Union. Yeah. Well, let me talk about the Roman comparison a little bit. The Roman Republic is extremely important to the United States. Many of our ideas come from the Roman Republic, which ended in 31 BC with the coming to power of Octavian, the grand nephew of Julius Caesar, who then became the god Augustus Caesar, the first Roman emperor, a military dictator, who was then succeeded, if I can remember them accurately, by Tiberius, Caligula, Claudius, and Nero, about as awful characters as one could ever imagine. No one in his right mind should ever conceive that the Roman Empire produced good government. It produced military dictatorship. In the first 2 centuries, but again, just to go back to the influence of Rome on the United States, you'll recall that the great articles by Madison, Hay, and I can't remember who the third was, the great articles defending the Constitution in the Federalist Papers are all signed Publius. Well, who was Publius? He was the first Roman consul in the Roman Republic. That's where we get separation of powers, term limits, toleration of slavery, other such things. It is one of the things that worries me in the United States today. I think it's fairly easy to imagine the end of the George Bush administration. I still am not certain that whoever replaces him, of either party, can stand up to the interests of the Pentagon and the intelligence agencies. After all, even if you had an honest Congress, they can't do oversight when 40% of the defense budget is secret from everybody. Like maybe 1 or 2 very senior members of Congress can get access to some of it. All the intelligence budgets are secret. This is a concentration of power in the executive branch that is unprecedented, then even more sort of slightly Roman in the way of transfer of power. I mean, the Senate, by the end of the Republic, the Senate was worthless. It was a club of wealthy Romans, but who simply were there to rubber stamp anything that Caesar did. We saw this, I think, the most critical issue in our society. In October of 2002, our Congress overwhelmingly voted to give the president the right to go to war when he wanted to, on his decision alone, including the use of nuclear weapons. James Madison, easily the most important author of our Constitution, said that the clause in the Constitution reserving the right to go to war to the elected representatives of the people is the single most important clause in the Constitution. Never, ever should such a power be entrusted to a single man. In October of 2002, our Congress, both parties, kissed off the Constitution. And that's the issue today, almost more than anything else. I fear at times that we seem to be treading the same steps as the former Soviet Union. We now know with precision and from ample sources inside Russia of the things that brought the Soviet Union down. It had absolutely nothing to do with Ronald Reagan or Star Wars. The Soviet Union was brought down by 3 things, all 3 of which strike me as parallel in America in the first years of the 21st century. First, extreme economic rigidity driven by ideology. That is, the inability to reform our economic institutions in ways that need to be done because of the power of ideology. It was Marxism-Leninism in the case of Russia that prevented Mikhail Gorbachev from being able to improve Russian efficiency. In our society, we see it in the whole world of corporate corruption, the belief that the stock exchange is no longer a functioning market, but is in fact a club of crooks, the ripping off of workers' pension funds, the savaging of corporate profits by inside executives, as in the case of Enron, Tyco, WorldCom, whatever else you may want to say. The second, imperial overstretch. Now this is where the issue that just came up. The fact that you get, over time, playing the imperial role just as the Roman Republic did. You get too many commitments, and you start making too many enemies. There's too many cases of blowback out there. We now have, the Department of Defense acknowledges well over 700 American military bases in other people's countries. This is at the same time not to mention another 300 that are at least secret, that are kept totally secret. The intelligence bases, many of the bases that we simply don't acknowledge we have, like Bondsteel in Kosovo and places like that. The bases in Great Britain that are disguised as Royal Air Force bases, any number of installations that we don't want to publicly disclose are functioning American military bases. Many of you will remember in Watergate that Nixon's chief of staff, Haldeman, one day denounced John Dean for speaking too freely about the felonies committed by the president in Congress. And he said, John, you know, once you've squeezed all the toothpaste out of the tube, it's very hard to get it back in. Well, it's a homely metaphor by a man who went to prison and a former advertising executive. But in a certain sense, that's the United States today. That's the imperial overstretch. You begin to squeeze too much out in too many commitments, too many other places, and you can't reverse it. The third thing that brought down the Soviet Union was the inability to reform. And there it is an interesting fact that as a professor of international relations, we normally teach our students there are no known cases of empires that went quietly, that didn't resist their own demise, that didn't fight at the end. One of the few exceptions you might make is probably the Soviet Empire, in that Mikhail Gorbachev was trying very hard at the end to reverse the Russian Empire. He was quite ready to kiss off the satellites in East Europe, including East Germany, because he wanted better relations with France and Germany, and he and his people had begun to identify Russia as a European country, and they wanted to dismantle the Stalinist system. Nonetheless, he was stopped by vested interests in the Cold War system, in the Soviet system as structured, just as I believe today anyone in America who attempted serious reform will then run into unimaginable vested interests. I mean, we see it every time. I mean, I don't particularly like Donald Rumsfeld as Secretary of Defense, but I agree with him on the need to close bases. We have 6,000 military bases in the United States alone. He has said he'd like to close a quarter of the Army bases and a third of the air bases. I tell you that every time he even opens his mouth like that, you get a firestorm on Capitol Hill from extremely liberal senators. I mean, the senators from California, from Washington, etc., saying, oh my God, you can't close bases in my state. Our people work there. They make a living making depleted uranium munitions, multiple megaton atom bombs. These are lovely little jobs that we'd like to keep. Those are vested interests. Those are serious vested interests that I don't easily see how they would be defeated except by a totally unforeseen renaissance of the American public, regaining their civic consciousness, retaking control of the country. Should the public continue to educate itself via the internet and things like that, one could imagine a renaissance in America. Barring that, I fear, like the Soviet Union from 1989 to 1991, we are Nemesis, the goddess of vengeance, the goddess of the punisher of hubris and arrogance, awaits her meeting with us, and awaits rather impatiently. And it is fairly late in the day. One could speculate in many different ways on it, but the most obvious things are that it would require a reform of Congress, a reform of the corrupted election laws. They would then have to retake Congress and use the powers given to Congress in the Constitution to begin to cut off money to the intelligence agencies and to the Department of Defense. The Department of Defense is not a Department of Defense. It's an alternative source of government.